The salt wind whips through the narrow streets of Monacoville, carrying the metallic scent of the sea and the low, mournful groan of ships' horns in the harbor below. It is the night of October 8, 1731. Torches sputter in their iron cages, casting fractured shadows against the ancient stone of the prince's palace. Inside those hallowed walls, a woman, Louise Hippolyte, Princess of Monaco, lies dying. She is only 33. On the velvet coverlet beside her, a 2-year-old boy sleeps, his tiny hand clutching the embroidered edge of her sleeve. He does not stir as his mother's grip loosened. He does not hear the priests whisper their final Latin prayers, but in the silence that follows, as the candlelight flickers and the sea crashes against the rock, the weight of 8 centuries suddenly shifts to his small, sleeping shoulders. The dynasty does not die with the princess. In the darkness, a child inherits a throne the size of a village, surrounded by enemies who want it gone. To understand how such a fragile legacy survived against all odds, we must leave this deathbed and travel back through time, to a fortress where the first Grimaldi seized power with a sword in one hand and a monk's disguise in the other. The year is 1297. Europe is a tapestry of warring city-states, feuding noble houses, and a papacy that struggles to command obedience from kings. On the rocky coast of the Italian Riviera, the fortress of Monaco sits like a weathered tooth, jutting out into the sapphire sea. It is not a principality yet. It is merely a strategic prize, a clifftop castle controlled by the Genoese, a faction of the powerful Ghibellines who pledge allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor. But on the night of January 8th, a man arrives who will change the destiny of that rock forever. His name is François Grimaldi. To his enemies, he is known as Malizia, the Malicious, but to his small band of exiled followers, he is simply a man who has lost everything and is desperate to take it back. François is a Guelph, an exile from the Republic of Genoa, driven from his home by political rivals. He has no land, no title, and no army to speak. What he has is a singular, obsessive focus. He has watched the fortress of Monaco for months. He has counted the guards. He has charted the tide. He knows that a direct assault is suicide. The walls of the rock are sheer, the gates are iron, and the garrison is loyal to Genoa. To take it by force would require an army he does not possess. But François understands something that brute force generals often forget. A fortress is only as strong as the minds of the men inside it, and men's minds are susceptible to faith. On that cold January night, François and a handful of his most trusted men do not approach the fortress wearing armor or carrying siege ladders. They approach dressed in the coarse gray habits of Franciscan friars. Their swords are hidden beneath their robes. Their faces are hidden beneath their hoods. They carry no weapons in their hands, only the humble wooden crosses that mark them as men of God. The wind howls off the Mediterranean, carrying the chill of winter deep into the stone walls. The guards on the gate, numb from the cold and the monotony, peer down at the small group of monks standing at the threshold. They see nothing threatening. They see piety. They see beggars seeking shelter. "Open the gates," one of the guards mutters to his companion, stamping his feet to keep warm. "Let them in before they freeze." It is a moment of simple, human mercy, and it is the precise moment the Grimaldi dynasty is born. The heavy oak gates grind open. The sound echoes through the fortress courtyard. The monks file in, their heads bowed, their hands clasped in prayer. The guards hardly give them a second glance. They turn their backs, eager to return to their hearth and their wine. It is the last mistake they will ever make. As the last monk clears the gate, a shout goes up from within the group. It is a cry of war, sharp and metallic in the night air. François Grimaldi throws off his gray habit. Beneath it, his chainmail glints in the torchlight. He draws his sword, a blade that has been hidden beneath the wool, cold as ice, sharp as ambition. His men follow suit. The courtyard, silent a moment ago, erupts into chaos. The garrison is taken completely by surprise. They scramble for their weapons, but it is too late. The monks have become wolves. The battle is not a long one. It is a brutal, desperate affair fought in the narrow corridors and spiral staircases of the fortress. The clash of steel, the shouts of the dying, the flicker of panic in the eyes of men who realize too late that they have been tricked, all of it unfolds in a matter of minutes. By the time the first light of dawn streaks across the horizon, staining the sea the color of blood, the fortress is his. François Grimaldi stands atop the highest tower, his sword still in his hand. his breath misting in the cold morning air. He looks down at the tiny harbor, at the fishing boats rocking gently in the swell. He looks inland at the hills of his homeland from which he was cast out. He has no kingdom. He has no vast treasury. He has only this rock, this fortress perched on the edge of the world. But it is his. The flag he raises that morning is not the grand heraldry of a mighty king. It is a simple white banner, emblazoned with a red cross, the symbol of the Guelph faction. But history will remember something else about that moment. It will remember the man, the cunning, and the sheer audacity of a desperate exile who traded a monk's robe for a prince's crown. François Grimaldi will not hold the fortress for long. The Genoese will return months later, driving him back into exile. His victory is temporary. His descendants will spend the next century fighting, losing, and reclaiming the rock in an endless cycle of blood and betrayal. But the seed is planted. The claim is staked. The name Grimaldi is now forever tied to that promontory of red stone jutting into the Mediterranean. In a world where dynasties rise and fall with the seas, the Grimaldi have done something remarkable. They have shown that survival is not about the size of your army. It is about the size of your will. In the years that follow, the Grimaldi will claw their way back again and again. They will marry into powerful family. They will swear fealty to kings when it suits them, and betray those kings when it serves them. They will learn the art of survival in the shadow of giants. They will understand that to rule a rock, you must be more cunning than the empires that surround you. And yet, for all their cunning, for all their ambition, they will soon face a threat far greater than any Genoese garrison. It is a threat that will force them to choose between the one thing that makes them princes and the one thing that keeps them alive. They will have to choose between sovereignty and survival. It is a choice that will define the house of Grimaldi for the next 500 years. More than 3 centuries after François Grimaldi seized the fortress in a monk's disguise, his descendants find themselves caught in a trap of their own making. The year is 1610, and the Rock of Monaco is no longer just a pirate's lair or a disputed fortress. It is a principality, small but sovereign, ruled by a prince who calls himself lord of a few square miles of coastal cliffs. But sovereignty, for a prince without an army, is a fragile thing. It is a word written on paper, easily erased by the sword. Honoré II, Lord of Monaco, knows this better than anyone. He inherited a title, but he also inherited a debt. Not a debt of money, but a debt of loyalty. For generations, the Grimaldi have survived by bowing to whichever power controlled the Mediterranean. They have served the King of France. They have served the King of Spain. They have bent their knees to emperors and popes, offering their fortress as a strategic pawn in exchange for protection. But by the early 17th century, the balance of power has shifted. Spain, under the Habsburg dynasty, has become the dominant force in Italy and the western Mediterranean. Spanish garrisons occupy the fortress of Monaco. Spanish soldiers patrol the streets. Spanish officials sit in the prince's council. Honoré II wears a crown, but he looks around his own palace and sees the uniforms of a foreign power. He is a sovereign in name only. In truth, he is a governor, ruling at the pleasure of the King of Spain. The walls of his palace, once a symbol of Grimaldi defiance, now feel like a cage. He walks the same corridors where François drew his sword, but now he hears the clink of Spanish spurs on the stone. He looks out the same windows at the same sea, but now he sees Spanish galleons, their flags snapping in the wind, reminding him that his kingdom is little more than a Spanish outpost. Honoré is a proud man. His portraits show a face of aristocratic refinement, a pointed beard, dark eyes that hold a simmering frustration, a mouth that is perpetually on the verge of speech. He paces his study at night, the candlelight casting long shadows across the map spread on his table. He writes letters, then burns them. He forms plans, then abandons them. He knows that any overt move against Spain will mean the end of his dynasty. The Spanish will simply remove him and install a governor. The Grimaldi name will become a footnote in the archives of Genoa. But he also knows that if he does nothing, he will preside over the slow suffocation of his house. His children will grow up speaking Spanish, marrying Spanish nobles, forgetting that they were ever princes of Monaco. The solution, when it comes, is not a sudden rebellion or a glorious battle. It is a letter, a single, carefully worded letter, carried by a trusted servant across the mountains to Paris. Honoré II writes to the King of France, Louis XIII. He does not ask for an alliance. He does not ask for an army. He offers something far more valuable. He offers Monaco itself. Sire, he writes, I am resolved to place myself, my state, and my fortress under the protection of your majesty. I desire no other master than the King of France. It is a surrender, but it is a strategic surrender. Honoré understands something that his ancestors understood instinctively. Survival is not about independence. It is about choosing the right master. Spain treats Monaco as a conquered territory. France, he hopes, will treat it as a valued ally. The gamble is enormous. If the Spanish discover his correspondence, he will be executed for treason. If the French betray him, he will have sacrificed his sovereignty for nothing. For 10 years, he plays a double game. He smiles at the Spanish commanders in his palace. He hosts their banquets. He listens to their boasts. All the while, his letters to Paris grow more desperate. I am losing my patience, he writes to a French agent. I would rather die than continue under this tyranny. Finally, in 1641, the moment arrives. Spain, weakened by decades of war, is no longer the invincible power it once was. France, under the brilliant statesman Cardinal Richelieu, sees an opportunity to drive a wedge into Spanish territory on the Mediterranean. Honoré II acts. With French troops waiting just beyond the hills, he confronts the Spanish garrison. He demands they leave his principality. When they refuse, he gives the signal. The French pour down from the mountain. The Spanish, caught between the French army and the prince's own loyal guards, surrender. For the first time in nearly a century, the Rock of Monaco is free of foreign soldiers. Honoré II walks to the highest tower, just as Francois did 3 centuries before. But he does not raise a flag of independence. He raises the fleur-de-lis of France alongside his own Grimaldi banner. He has saved his dynasty, but he has paid a price. The King of France names him a duke and a peer of France, a title of immense prestige. But the title comes with a price. Monaco is now officially a protectorate of France. Honoré II is a vassal, not a sovereign. When the French king summons him to Paris, he must go. When the French king demands soldiers or ships, he must provide them. He returns to his palace after the French troops withdraw. The corridors are empty of Spanish soldiers. The silence is his again, but it is a hollow silence. He sits on his throne, a throne that is now technically a gift from the King of France, and he wonders if he has saved his dynasty or merely postponed its death. He looks out the window at the sea, at the horizon where the Mediterranean meets the sky, and he understands a terrible truth. His ancestors fought to win this rock. He has fought to keep it, but in keeping it, he has surrendered the very thing that made it worth keeping. The Grimaldi are now princes in the shadow of the French crown. They will serve the kings of France for the next 150 years. They will send their sons to fight in French wars. They will empty their treasury to pay French taxes. They will become more French than Monégasque, more courtiers than princes. And one day, when the French crown itself is shattered by revolution, the Grimaldi will discover that the shadow they chose for protection has become the very thing that threatens to consume them. By the late 18th century, the House of Grimaldi has become a fixture of the French aristocracy. The princes of Monaco spend most of their time not on their rocky promontory, but in the glittering salons of Paris. They marry French noble. They wear French silks. They speak French with such refinement that the Ligurian dialect of their ancestors fades from memory. Monaco itself, the tiny principality that Francois seized with a sword, has become a distant estate, a place to collect taxes from, a footnote in the family ledger. Honoré III, the reigning prince, is the embodiment of this transformation. He is a soldier, a man of the Enlightenment, a friend to philosophers and generals. He commands a regiment in the French army. He sits in the French court. He considers himself, above all else, a French nobleman. Monaco is a title he holds, not a home he loves. His wife, Marie-Catherine de Brignolles, shares this world of privilege. She is a woman of extraordinary beauty and intelligence, a patron of the arts, a hostess whose salons attract the brightest minds of Paris. Her life is one of velvet and candlelight, of whispered witticisms and the rustle of silk gowns. She has no reason to believe that any of it will ever change. But in the summer of 1789, change arrives with the force of a thunderclap. The French Revolution does not begin with a single event. It begins with a murmur that grows into a roar. It begins with hungry crowds in the streets of Paris, with pamphlets passed in secret, with the first stirrings of an idea that terrifies the aristocracy. The idea that power belongs not to kings and princes, but to the people. Marie Catherine is in Paris when the Bastille falls on July 14th. She hears the distant rumble of the mob, the crack of musket fire, the bells of the city ringing in alarm. She watches from her windows as the crowds surge through the streets, their faces lit by torchlight, their voices raised in a song that sounds like both prayer and threat. At first, she does not understand what is happening. She is a princess of an ancient house. She is protected by the King of France, by the laws of the realm, by centuries of tradition. Surely, she thinks, this madness will pass. The crowds will disperse. The summer sun will burn off Paris will return to its rhythms of pleasure and intrigue. But the fever does not break, it spreads. The months that follow are a slow, inexorable descent into chaos. The National Assembly strips the nobility of their titles. The church is dismantled. The king is forced from Versailles to Paris, a prisoner in his own capital, and everywhere there is suspicion. Neighbor turns against neighbor. Servants denounce master. The air is thick with accusation, with the smell of fear, with the ever-present possibility that a knock on the door will be the last sound you ever hear. Honoré III, ever the pragmatist, tries to navigate the storm. He renounces his feudal rights. He declares his support for the revolution. He believes, perhaps naively, that if he shows himself to be a man of the people, he will be spared. But the revolution does not spare anyone. It consumes everything. It is a fire that burns until there is nothing left to burn. Marie Catherine watches her husband's careful calculations and sees something he does not: the futility of compromise. The revolutionaries do not want reformed nobles. They want dead nobles. Every concession is a sign of weakness. Every gesture of loyalty is interpreted as a mask for treason. In 1793, the revolution reaches its most violent phase. The king is executed. The queen follows him to the guillotine. The reign of terror begins, and no one is safe. The streets of Paris run with blood. The prisons fill with men and women whose only crime is having been born into a world that no longer exists. Marie Catherine knows that her time is running out. Her name, de Brignole, marks her as aristocracy. Her title, Princess of Monaco, marks her as royalty. Her husband's careful political maneuvering has bought them time, but time is a currency that is rapidly depleting. She makes a choice. It is not a heroic choice. It is not a noble choice. It is the choice of a woman who wants to live. She writes a letter to the revolutionary authorities. In it, she renounces her title. She renounces her husband. She renounces everything that she has been, everything that her ancestors fought to become. She offers herself to the revolution as a simple citizen, a woman without a past, a blank slate on which the new republic can write whatever it wishes. But the revolution does not believe in blank slates. It believes in guilt. And in the eyes of the revolutionaries, Marie Catherine's guilt is written in every line of her face, every gesture of her hand, every memory of the salons where she once held court. On the morning of her arrest, she dresses carefully. She chooses a simple white dress, the color of mourning, the color of innocence. She brushes her hair until it shines. She looks in the mirror and sees a woman who is about to die, but who will not die afraid. The knock comes at dawn. The revolutionary guards fill her apartment with their boots and their bayonets, their shouts and their accusations. They read her name from a list. They take her arm, not roughly, but with the impersonal efficiency of men who have done this 100 times before. As they lead her out, she pauses at the door. She looks back at the room where she spent so many hours, where she laughed and argued and dreamed. She sees the books on the table, the portrait of her son on the mantel, the morning light falling across the worn Persian rug. She takes a breath and she walks out. She is taken to the conciergerie, the prison that serves as antechamber to the guillotine. The cells are damp, crowded, filled with the sound of weeping and prayer. She waits, as so many waited, for the moment when her name will be called. But the terror does not take her. In a twist of fate that seems almost miraculous, the revolutionary tribunal delays her trial, then delays it again. The months pass. The terror begins to exhaust itself. Robespierre falls. The guillotine slows. Marie Catherine is released. She is one of the lucky ones. She has survived. But when she walks out of the prison, blinking in the pale sunlight, she is no longer a princess. Her husband is dead, worn out by the years of struggle, dying in exile in England. Her son is a fugitive wandering Europe, trying to reclaim a throne that no longer exists. Monaco itself has been seized by the French Republic, renamed, absorbed into the new order as if it had never been a principality at all. She returns to Paris, to a city that has forgotten her. She lives quietly in a small apartment on a small pension. She watches the rise of Napoleon, the fall of empire, the endless churn of history, and she wonders sometimes if the Grimaldi dynasty has finally reached its end. Her son, Honoré IV, has no principality to rule. His son, Honoré V, will spend his life fighting in foreign armies, trying to reclaim a rock that seems to have slipped forever from Grimaldi hand. The family that François founded with a sword in one hand and a monk's robe in the other now owns nothing but a name, a memory, and a faded portrait of a fortress by the sea. The dynasty, it seems, has finally run out of cunning. The 19th century dawns over Europe with a thunder of cannon. Napoleon Bonaparte reshapes the continent, crowns himself emperor, and in the process, redraws borders as easily as a child rearranges blocks. Monaco, that tiny speck on the Mediterranean coast, is swept up in the chaos. The Grimaldi princes, scattered and dispossessed, watch from exile as their ancestral home becomes a French department, its ancient fortress stripped of its cannon, its prince's palace turned into a barracks for French soldiers. When Napoleon falls, the Congress of Vienna convenes to stitch Europe back together. The great powers, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, sit around a table and decide the fate of millions. They restore throne. They redraw maps. They create a new order designed to last 100 years. But Monaco is an afterthought, a minor detail, a footnote in the margins of the great settlement. The Congress restores the Grimaldi to their throne, but the restoration is a mockery. The principality has been gutted. The towns of Menton and Roquebrune, which together made up nearly 95% of Monaco's territory, declare their independence. They refuse to return to Grimaldi rule. They place themselves under the protection of the Kingdom of Sardinia. The prince who returns to Monaco is not returning to a kingdom, he is returning to a ghost. Honoré V, the new sovereign, arrives in 1815 to find his palace empty, his treasury bare, his subjects reduced to a few hundred fishermen and farmers huddled on the rock. The grand halls where his ancestors once entertained ambassadors and kings now echo with the footsteps of a single man. The throne room, once a symbol of Grimaldi sovereignty, is a cavernous space filled with dust and silence. Honoré V is not a man suited to this diminished world. He has spent his life in armies, fighting for thrones that were not his own. He is a soldier, rigid, formal, uncomfortable with anything that does not fit within the neat lines of military order. He looks at his crumbling principality and sees not a home, but a burden. He does not stay. He returns to France, to the estates he owns there, leaving Monaco to be governed by a distant administrator. The prince becomes an absentee landlord, visiting the rock only when politics demands it, spending most of his days in Paris, pretending that nothing has changed. But everything has changed. The fishermen of Monaco watch their prince's carriage disappear down the coastal road, and they know, with a certainty that needs no words, that they have been abandoned. The years pass. Honoré V dies. His brother Florestan succeeds him. Florestan is even less suited to rule than his brother. He is a man of the theater, a writer of mediocre plays, a dreamer who sees the principality not as a responsibility but as a curiosity. He visits Monaco rarely, and when he does, he complains about the damp, the isolation, the lack of good conversation. The people of Monaco, those few hundred souls who have stayed, watch their prince's disinterest and respond in kind. They stop paying taxes. They ignore his decrees. They treat the palace as a museum, a relic of a time that has passed. The Grimaldi flag still flies from the tower, but it is a symbol without meaning, a piece of cloth waving in the wind. By the middle of the century, the situation has become desperate. The towns of Menton and Roquebrune, which declared their independence 40 years earlier, show no signs of returning. The Kingdom of Sardinia supports their rebellion, hoping to absorb them permanently. The French government, tired of the constant squabbling, threatens to simply annex the entire region and be done with it. The Grimaldi dynasty, after more than 500 years of survival, is facing its final crisis. There is no army to call upon, no foreign power willing to intervene, no treasury to fund a diplomatic campaign. There is only an empty palace, a few hundred impoverished subjects, and a prince who would rather be in Paris writing plays than in Monaco ruling a kingdom that no longer exists. Florstan's son, Charles III, inherits this disaster. He is a young man, barely 30, with a face that shows the strain of trying to hold together something that is falling apart. He watches his father's theater friends come and go from the palace, laughing and drinking while the principality crumbles around them, and he feels a cold, bitter anger building inside him. He confronts his father. "We are losing everything," he says. "The people hate us. The French want to take us. The Sardinians are stealing our land. And you sit here writing comedies as if none of it matters." Florestan looks at his son with the sad, distracted eyes of a man who has spent his life dreaming of other things. "What would you have me do?" he asks. "We have no army. We have no money. We have no friends." Charles has no answer. He turns away, walks out of the room, down the long corridor lined with portraits of his ancestors. François Grimaldi stares down at him, the man who seized this rock with a sword. Honoré II stares down at him, the man who traded sovereignty for survival. They are all watching him, these ghosts of the past, waiting to see what will do. He walks out onto the terrace overlooking the sea. The sun is setting, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. The harbor below is empty except for a few fishing boats. The streets of Monacoville are quiet, the shops closed, the people gone inside. He stands there, the last prince of a dying dynasty, and he makes a decision. He will not let it end. He does not know how he will save his principality. He does not know where the money will come from, or the allies, or the miracle he needs. But he knows one thing with absolute certainty. He will not be the Grimaldi who let the rock fall. He turns away from the sea and walks back into the palace. He will find a way. He has to. Because if he does not, then 500 years of cunning, of sacrifice, of survival will have been for nothing. And in the darkness of that empty palace, in the silence of a kingdom that has forgotten it was ever a kingdom, Charles III begins to search for an answer. The answer, when it comes, will not come from armies or alliances. It will not come from the old ways, the ways of François and Honoré. It will come from a place that no Grimaldi has ever looked before, the future. The man who saves the house of Grimaldi is not the warrior his ancestors would have recognized. He is not a cunning schemer like François, not a diplomatic gambler like Honoré II. He is something new, something the dynasty has never produced before. A scientist. Albert I, who ascends the throne in 1889 after his father Charles III's long and difficult reign, is a man out of time. He would have been more comfortable in a university laboratory than a palace. He would rather spend months at sea on a research vessel than sit on a throne listening to petitioner. He is tall, bearded, with the weathered face of a sailor and the intense, probing eyes of a man who has spent his life asking questions. But he is also, perhaps without meaning to be, the savior of his dynasty. When Albert inherits the throne, Monaco is still a principality on life support. His father, Charles III, found the answer to the dynasty's financial crisis, but it was an answer that horrified the old nobility. In the 1860s, faced with bankruptcy, Charles took a desperate gamble. He legalized gambling. He allowed a pair of French businessmen, François Blanc and his wife Marie, to build a casino on a barren plateau called Les Spelous. The gamble paid off beyond anyone's imagination. The casino transformed Monaco from a forgotten backwater into a playground for the European elite. The money poured in. The principality was saved. But the old guard, the aristocrats who traced their lineage back to the Genoese exile, looked at the roulette wheels and the card tables and saw the death of Grimaldi honor. They whispered that the dynasty had sold its soul. Albert, when he takes the throne, hears those whisper. He feels them. And he knows, with the certainty of a man who has spent his life in the pursuit of knowledge, that his father's work is incomplete. The casino has saved Monaco financially, but it has not given the principality a purpose. It has made the Grimaldi rich, but it has not made them respected. Albert looks at his tiny kingdom and sees a place that needs more than money. It needs meaning. He finds that meaning in the sea. From his youth, Albert has been fascinated by the ocean. He is not a casual sailor, not a prince who keeps a yacht for pleasure cruises. He is a serious oceanographer, a pioneer of marine science, a man who personally leads expeditions into the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. He designs his own research vessels. He develops new techniques for deep-sea exploration. He collects specimens, takes measurements, publishes papers that are read by scientists across Europe. He brings this passion to Monaco. He conceives of a project that will change the principality forever, a museum dedicated to the sea. Not a dusty collection of shells and curiosity, but a living monument to oceanography, a center of research and education that will draw scientists from around the world. Construction begins in 1899. Albert does not simply hire architects and tell them what to build. He is involved in every detail. He sketches the design himself. He selects the stone, a pale limestone that will gleam in the Mediterranean sun. He insists that the museum be built on the edge of a sheer cliff, so that it seems to rise from the sea itself, a temple to the mystery of the deep. The Oceanographic Museum opens in 1910. It is a masterpiece. Its facade, 100 feet high, faces the sea like a fortress. Its interior is filled with aquariums, laboratories, libraries, the largest collection of marine specimens in the world. Albert stands at the entrance on opening day, watching the crowds file in, and for the first time in his life, he feels that he has done something worthy of his name. But the museum is more than a building. It is a declaration. It is Albert's answer to those who said the Grimaldi had sold their honor. The casino, he argues, was a necessity. It bought the dynasty time. But the museum is the future. It is proof that Monaco can be more than a playground for the rich. It can be a center of knowledge, a haven for science, a place where humanity's understanding of the natural world moves forward. Albert's reign is not easy. The First World War tears Europe apart, and Monaco, though neutral, feels the shockwaves. The casino empty, the tourists disappear, the museum's laboratories fall silent. Albert, now an old man, watches from his palace as the world he helped build crumbles around him. But he does not despair. He has spent his life on the sea, and he knows that tides ebb and flow. He knows that what is lost can be found again. He knows that the most important thing is to build something that will last, something that will survive the storm. When he dies in 1922, he leaves behind a principality transformed. Monaco is no longer just a fortress on a rock, no longer just a casino town, no longer just a relic of a vanished age. It is a place with a purpose, a place that looks to the future rather than the past. His grandson, Rainier III, will inherit that purpose. In the decades that follow, Rainier will build on Albert's foundation. He will preserve the dynasty's independence against threats from France. He will transform the casino town into a global center of culture and commerce. He will marry a Hollywood actress and turn Monaco into a fairy tale kingdom, a place of romance and glamour that captures the world's imagination. But the true architect of that future, the man who saw that a dynasty could survive not by clinging to the past, but by embracing the future, is Albert I. He is the Grimaldi who understood that a rock in the sea, no matter how small, can be a platform for greatness. He is the Grimaldi who looked at the horizon, at the endless expanse of the ocean, and saw not a limit but a possibility. He stands now in the history of his house as the bridge between the old world and the new. The cunning of Francois, the sacrifice of Honoré II, the tragedy of Marie Catherine, the endurance of Charles III, all of it flows through him and into the future. He takes the inheritance of centuries and reshapes it into something that can last. The House of Grimaldi has survived because it has never stopped changing. It has been pirates and princes, vassals and sovereigns, gamblers and scientists. It has bent but never broken. It has lost almost everything, again and again, and each time it has found a way to rise again. The flag that Francois raised over the fortress in 1297 still flies over the Palace of Monaco today. It is a banner of red and white, simple as a heartbeat, stubborn as the rock on which it stands. It has seen empires rise and fall. It has weathered revolutions, wars, the slow erosion of time. And still it flies, a small flag on a small rock in a vast sea, a testament to the truth that survival is not a matter of size or strength, but of will. The Grimaldi understood that. They understood that a dynasty, like a fortress, must be built on something solid. For them, that something has always been the rock, not the stone itself, but what the stone represents. A place to stand, a foundation to build on, a home that no enemy can take because it exists not just in the land, but in the blood. 700 years after a man in a monk's robe drew a sword in a moonlit courtyard, the descendants of François Grimaldi still rule the rock. They rule not because they are the strongest or the richest, but because they have always known that to survive, you must be willing to become something new. You must be willing to trade the sword for the cross for the crown for the laboratory for the future. And in that willingness, in that relentless, unyielding adaptability, lies the true secret of the House of Grimaldi. They are not the greatest dynasty in Europe. They are not the richest or the most powerful, but they are, perhaps, the most enduring. And on a night in January, when the wind blows off the sea and the lights of Monaco shimmer against the darkness, it is possible to believe that they always will be.